Father God, I pray that the words that we hear are the words you want us to hear, not necessarily the words that I speak. Today, we continue our series of sermons entitled A Building Project. And to this end, Nehemiah is a great study of leadership, but also a great study in obedience to God. Last week, we saw Nehemiah establishing a watch system while they worked, and this put the people on guard to protect them from the enemy. However, it's a two-edged sword because at the same time, it lets the enemy know that they're being watched, which deflated the enemy somewhat. Then they went back to work with the same vision to rebuild Jerusalem's walls. That small phrase last week from Mike invoked so many memories for me, especially of working with a weapon alongside me. Wherever I went, the weapon went. Now you've got to understand that that includes the bathroom and the shower. You don't let it out of your sight because you might just need it. In their case, they carried a sword, whilst I was on with a modern day sword, sometimes called a submachine gun, but the idea is the same. Work, but be ready to fight if need be. However, enough of my memories. Let's get back to Nehemiah in Jerusalem. Now, this morning we're going to get an oversight and a view of what's going on behind the walls and inside the city. But it's worth remembering at this point that the greatest wall ever built will never stand if the society behind it is broken. And that is a tremendous lesson for us today. Imagine this. Nehemiah wakes up and sets off to work, overseeing the building of the wall with all his workers, this huge project that God has set him to do. He arrives at the current workplace, and because Nehemiah is seen as a man in authority, he finds that there is a delegation waiting to speak to him. Furthermore, he gets an inkling of just how desperate things are and how dire things have become, because in the same delegation, there are women, a most unusual occurrence at that time. So the people make their problems known to Nehemiah, but to his surprise, the complaints are against their fellow Jews, their religious brethren, rather than against the occupying power and the taxations being imposed upon them. Furthermore, the problem has affected all levels of society. The landless who labour in the fields, the landowners mortgaged to the hilt, and those who have had to borrow money to pay their taxes, and yet others have been forced to sell their children into slavery. Not a pretty picture. The landless have had to ask the government for grain so that they could even live. The landowners mortgaged to the hilt, and the crops have failed consistently. Furthermore, their loans are now so numerous that even to survive, they have to scrape by and borrow more. The third group are the other landowners, but for them the issue is taxation. The king's taxes are so high that they too are mortgaged to their eyeballs and are facing imminent ruin if nothing changes. A word about the taxes of the time there. They were quite high, and as soon as the king received the money in gold or silver coin, it was melted down and bullion bars were cast. These were then stored away. Very little money was used to run the empire, and even less worked its way back into the areas that paid the taxes to improve things. And there's an example of how much how Artaxerxes was storing. When Alexander took Susa, he found approximately 270 tons of stored gold bullion and 1,200 of stored silver bullion. And that was only in Susa. It does Remind me, though, of how things can be in third world countries today that have their independence and get so much foreign aid. Little foreign aid trickles down to the people that need it, whilst the leaders seem to amass stacks of money in Swiss bank accounts. Anyway, in Jerusalem at that time, as more and more coins disappeared from circulation, so inflation took off like a rocket. Finally, in verse 5, we find the cause of the delegation's complaints. They are doing this to one another, even though they're the same flesh and blood, and therefore considered brothers and sisters. They have had to subject themselves and their own children to slavery and debt. The daughters are being enslaved, which in itself is disgraceful. The payment of debt at that time through enslavement wasn't illegal, but the law had safeguards built in, even though that too is at its limit. You have to imagine these parents, defenseless and unable to help their own children because their houses, their fields, their vineyards all belong to somebody else. The economic oppression these people are suffering has caused a crippling cycle in that they must borrow to eat, but then they must take out a loan to repay the debt that they borrowed. Then they had to enslave themselves in order to pay back the loan. But as they needed to eat still, they had to borrow more in order to eat. The vicious debt cycle takes over, along with rampant inflation. Now, if there was ever a clear-cut example of debt being silly, that is a prime example. Even today, we see people get into debt. Then they borrow money to get out of debt, but then just get into deeper debt. Then they borrow more money to pay off the first debts, and the debt gets bigger. Then they reach maximum capacity, panic, and borrow even more money, and the cycle just goes on and on and on, with bigger loans which never seem to be able to get paid off. If any of us are in this cycle, then we need to get some professional advice, guidance, and help to solve it. Nehemiah, though, was quite angry at this situation. But instead of confronting the issue head on, he paused and pondered for a while. Yes, it seems like he prayed and waited again. Finally, after consideration, he rebuked those who were responsible. Look at his words. You are charging your own people usury. You're doing this to yourselves. It's not even somebody else's doing. Usury is not about charging interest. It's about charging excessive interest at higher rates. For example, a 1% interest rate per month doesn't sound like very much, does it? But over the year, that works out at around 12.5% per annum. Even today, unsecured credit, such as on your credit cards, attracts a rate of interest of around 1.8% per month. Again, it doesn't sound much until you realize that's 24% per annum. And in my opinion, both of those rates are usurious. Nehemiah felt a huge moral outrage, and so he decided he must act, and went on to point out that they had brought their people back from slavery, but they were now selling one another to each other, and then being sold back again. It was stupid and had to stop. They were demeaning one another, and so Nehemiah addressed their values. Rather than just reminding them of the law, and his indictment to them was critical. A correct response to God would be to put personal ambition aside. And walking in the fear of the Lord means that we consider him first, not ourselves. And so he made a pledge with the men and women in Jerusalem. And as a result, the creditors were now willing to write off the debts and the interest. They had promised to give back what they had charged, but there was a severity in this pledge. And Nehemiah laid it on the line, and he made the creditors take an oath to that effect. As he shook out the folds of his robes, it was meant to be a ceremonial action to give the proclamation more power, or in modern parlance we say an exclamation mark. And if they failed in their agreement, they would be judged by the Lord. And they all agreed. So far, so good. We now might think the whole thing is settled, but we cannot fix something temporarily. If we really want that change to take hold, we have to model it and lead it by example. Nehemiah decided to lead by example once he established his governorship over Jerusalem for 12 years. It's not clear if he was appointed before he left Susa, but it is possible. After all, he does have the authority to get the wall construction underway and it to completion, along with the city gates being reinstalled. But there is something different about his leadership. Nobody in his employment took from the others, even though it was customary to offer food to the governor or pay excessive taxes. Instead, Nehemiah stands by his agreement made with the nobles. Not only that, but he doesn't even take the things that he is entitled to because of his position. I have to add here, imagine the difference if today's elected officials were really doing the job in order to help those who vote for them, rather than doing the job to line their own pockets by claiming expenses for those things that we, being mortals, have to pay for as normal expenses. Imagine if our MPs refused their paid review, which they made compulsory, and instead offered the same as the peer review boards, which those same MPs made advisory, and accept the offer they made to the public workers and armed forces. What an example that would set. Don't hold your breath. Nehemiah refused to participate in a process that would cause more strain, even though it was his right to do so. But instead, he chose to live with integrity. He knew that those before him had done the exact opposite, hence the mess they were now in. And he knew that that doesn't work. And so he departed from the customs of the day. However, can we see why he chose to act like this? Out of reverence to God, he says, I did not act like that. His fear of the Lord far surpassed the desire to get all that he could. Indeed, he didn't even take all he was entitled to. His reverence for pleasing God is an example for us that we can have today. He exemplified the law, love for God and love for people. Rather than devoting himself to wealth, his focus was on restoring the city. And even more, he provided for those in his service out of his own pocket. Their mission was on the work ahead, not in promoting their own desires. Nehemiah's desire was that they would work together to restore their birthright city. Along with that, their needs were provided for without taxation. It is important to note that the amount of animals slaughtered each day might seem a bit high just to feed 150 officials. But the small print does point out he was also providing food for the poor and a lot of others as well. But why would Nehemiah live like this? The answer is simple. He was an official with a caring heart and knew the Jewish laws well. He has been sent to show the people how to live and how to care for one another by example rather than by decree. Remember his prayer. Remember me with favor, my God, for all I have done for these people. Nehemiah simply wanted God's approval. And don't we all? Isn't that we all cry out for? Oh, it's nice to have recognition from our peers and our bosses, but how much better is it to have God's approval and his pat on our back? Whenever I finished a particularly complex task on an aircraft and produced an aircraft unexpectedly, I invariably got a pat on the back from my boss. I always tried to remind him that the men on my team had done the work and that all I had done was to diagnose the problem and set them to work to produce the aircraft. Therefore, the credit was theirs, not mine. At the same time, I was trying to thank God for giving me the skills and brain power I needed to fix the machine in the first place. I often wondered, why me, Lord? Why me? So what's the lesson for us today? I think we have a couple of things we can take away with us. Nehemiah showed that as well as being a leader, he also cared for those around him and those who worked for him. Here in Almondshill, we are lucky. We are a very caring congregation. So much so that it has been remarked upon by new members of our congregation, not just once, but again and again. Not only do we care, but we also seek to do that which God has set us to do. And that not for our glory, but for God's greater glory. We don't seek the approval and applause of men. We seek the approval and the applause of God. If we follow the example of Nehemiah, we will receive that. Love God, love people. So let us take away a simple idea. Let's continue to care for others and work for God. Not for man's applause, but for that pat on the back from God. Amen.